And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo. And once again, I am trying to use some of the worst cards in Magic's history. I just think it's it is both, you know, a bit of a thought experiment to see if we can actually figure out great ways to use these cards. But it is also a lesson in don't be dismissive, right? Sometimes you see these cards and people will be dismissive about them because on their face they don't seem great, but sometimes you can actually find really interesting ways to use these cards. And in fact, I'll give you a perfect example of what I'm talking about here. Collapsing Borders, 3 and a red enchantment. Has the domain ability. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player gains 1 life for each basic land type among land they control, then Collapsing Border deals 3 damage to that player. So, you put this down, and obviously it is going to be hating on less colors, which in my opinion in the Commander format is not a great thing because I guess playing 3 colors or more is going to get nothing from this, right? It's going to do absolutely nothing. If you're in a game, which is entirely likely, that has every player with 3 or more colors, this does nothing because if you have, I mean, let's say you're playing an Abzan deck at the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to control a forest, swamp, and a plains. You're going to gain 3 life for all those basic land types. Then this is going to deal 3 damage to you, so it's going to accomplish nothing. That's not why you're playing this card. You're playing this card for 2 reasons, I would say, but probably a lot more. Although it might seem like this card is equaling itself out because you gain the 3 life and then deal the 3 damage, it is still gaining life and dealing 3 damage. This is, and I don't know if there's any other card that does this, but this might be the only mono red card in the game of Magic that gains life. This is a mono red card that gains life. Even though at the end of the day, you might be having an equal amount of life that you originally had, this does indeed gain life. So if you're looking for an effect in red that's gaining life, this is doing this. This will get you a trigger off of, say, your Well of Lost Dreams if you're in a mono red deck. Now, you're only getting 1 life if you're in a mono red deck, but nevertheless, this is a red card that gains life. That is very significant. It also is dealing the 3 damage. Again, even if your opponent has a 5-color deck and they're going to gain 5 life, this still will deal 3 damage, and that can be really important. If you're in a, you know, I want my opponents to be taking damage every turn for whatever reason, right? If your opponent has lost life this turn, if your opponent has taken damage this turn, this is also non-combat damage. If you're in that Chandra's Incinerator sort of situation where you're playing cards like that, this will, even though again, it doesn't feel like it's actually accomplishing a whole lot, this is an automatic 3 damage done to that player every turn and will give you a trigger off your Chandra's Incinerator to deal 3 damage to a player as well, right? So even though at the end of the day, your opponent might have 0 life change with this effect, they are still gaining life and this is still dealing damage. That is very important to note. Next up, Hornet Cannon, 4 mana artifact. Pay 3 and tap, create a 1/1 colorless insect artifact creature token flying in haste named Hornet. Destroy it at the beginning of the next end step. Let's pretend this was not destroying the token. If this was just pay 3 and put an insect token into play, that's still not great. I will be honest. I will say, again, where might you want to play this? Okay. First of all, if you got a Darksteel Forge in play, the destroy doesn't do anything. So you can keep creating those tokens, have them get destroyed. But of course, destroy doesn't kill indestructible stuff, so they'll survive because obviously they're artifacts. That is one way to go with it. Another thing where this actually can be good is I just want likely artifact creatures entering the battlefield, like Luciel, right? Any commander that just, I want a trigger off of a artifact entering the battlefield or a creature entering the battlefield. You know, you don't care that it gets destroyed. I will say these guys should have Death Touch, shouldn't they? Shouldn't these be flying haste Hornets with Death Touch? I think they missed an opportunity there, but ultimately where this card I think is actually not bad is just I want a artifact or a creature entering the battlefield every turn to get a trigger. The fact that it destroys itself, don't care. However, it also gets you a dice trigger. So, geez, actually, you know what? Is this actually not a terrible fit in an ELSL core deck? I mean, I know you probably have lots of options there already, but whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life, and whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So with that, you're getting both of those triggers every single turn, right? So, you know, again, I don't know if I would necessarily throw it in that deck, but that is the kind of place where you want to be playing a card like that. Another card that is maybe notoriously bad, but funny enough, I actually mentioned it in my 10 cards video. And in fact, the last 3 cards that I'm talking about here might seem really, really bad, but I actually mentioned them in my 10 cards videos because I think there is a place for them. So Warping Worm, 2 blue and a green. Worm, 1/1. Has phasing. So, of course, that means phases in or out on untap. It basically switches every single turn. But here, it's a little bit different because at the beginning of your upkeep, Warping Worm phases out unless you pay 2 blue and a green. So this guy's going to phase out after you first play him and then phases in on untap, and then immediately on upkeep, you're going to have to pay the 4 or will phase out immediately again, which seems really, really bad, of course, right? You're paying 4 mana for a 1/1, and then you got to pay 4 every single turn to keep it around. However, when it phases in, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it will phase in, get a counter on it, and then you can immediately let it phase out again. And every single turn, it phases in, gets a counter, phases out. Now, I will just say that actually isn't super, super bad in a casual commander game, but even gets better. And the place that I actually put this in a deck once is in a Peer and Toothy deck. If you can start doubling up those counters, right? If your Peer is in play, that means when your Warping Worm phases in, you're going to get 2 counters on it. So now it's a 3/3, and then the next turn, it's now a 5/5, right? And this thing gets big really, really fast. And the big advantage to having this creature that only phases in for a tiny, tiny little window, like there's almost barely no window at all for your opponents to remove this guy. It is basically board wipe proof, right? So for me, I'm going to let this guy phase in, phase out every single turn, collecting counters on itself until someone casts a board wipe. Now there's no creatures in play. I untap, this phases in, it's now like a 9/9 or something. Now, okay, I'll pay the 4 and I can swing in for 9 damage very easily. So in that situation, I actually think it's not that bad. EarthLink, another card that I actually mentioned in one of my deck ideas videos, because I actually think it's pretty darn good in that strategy. 3 black, red, and a green enchantment at the beginning of your upkeep. Sacrifice it unless you pay 2. That's not great, but it does cost 6. Whenever a creature dies, that creature's controller sacrifices a land. That's a fantastic effect. And of course, whenever you have these symmetrical effects, which I love so much, you have to build around it. And the deck idea I had here, actually built this deck, is I just don't have any creatures at all, right? You build your deck to have no creatures, so the downside here doesn't hit you at all. I actually think it's a pretty good card there. It was actually a Daragaz reincarnated deck, because if Daragaz reincarnated would die, instead, exile it with 3 egg counters on, so your commander doesn't actually die, so your commander won't trigger this or a lot of other effects that I put in the deck. You can check out the deck. It basically hates on people for having creatures in play, which of course every deck does, except the one you're playing. So yeah, this effect might not seem super great, but it's actually pretty darn good, forcing your opponents to sacrifice their lands, right? All right, lastly, I will talk about Triassic Egg. Again, another card that apparently isn't very good, but I actually mentioned in a 10 cards video because it has a very unique effect. Again, another very important part of the Commander format is the color identity thing. And I don't know, maybe people are playing 5 and 4 and 3 color decks so frequently now that color identity is not even an issue for them, but I think it still is really significant in the Commander format. So 4 mana artifact, pay 3, tap, put a hatchling counter on Triassic Egg. Sacrifice Triassic Egg, choose 1, activate only if there are 2 or more hatchling counters on Triassic Egg. So you have to put 2 hatchling counters on it first. Of course, if you are in any sort of a proliferate theme, just putting 1 on there. So this is just 3 mana, tap it, then proliferate, and I can immediately sacrifice it because, of course, the sacrifice and the 2 counters is the only stipulation here, and you can do it at any time if you want. You may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That's pretty good. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That's also pretty good. And why this actually is not a bad fit in certain strategies, and why I actually think that it does deserve attention in the Commander format, despite the fact that someone will say it's 10 mana to do this. There's a lot of colors that don't do this at all, right? Obviously, if you're in green or maybe red, cheating creatures into play from your hand is not that difficult. There's lots of stuff that do that. But what if you're not in those colors? Then how are you going to do it, right? Return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield? Obviously, there's only a couple of colors that do that. White and black really are the only colors that do that. So what if you want to do that? What if I want to reanimate one of my creatures and I'm not in a color that does that? This is really one of the only options. How many other options, colorless options, are there for cheating a creature from your hand into play? Or more importantly, I would say, returning a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is the only one that I've come across. This is the only card, regardless of how bad it might seem, this is the only card that I've come across that can return a creature from graveyard to the battlefield. And if you have a commander with a dies trigger, that can be really, really important, right? If I say have a mono blue commander with a dies dies trigger, I might actually want to use this. And in fact, I might even be able to reuse it if I'm in a deck where I can return artifacts to play a lot easier than I can return creatures to play, like a mono red deck. So now I have a mono red commander with a dies trigger, and rather than having to recast it from the command zone all the time, I put this guy in play, and maybe my commander's kind of expensive already. So I'm sitting here putting counters on it, have my commander die, sack this to get my commander back, and then because I'm in a mono red deck, I can very easily Goblin Welder get this thing back, or Trash for Treasure, or whatever. That is where I actually think this is not a bad fit at all. Might seem like a really bad card, but again, the Commander format is what's great about stuff like this. Pretty much all the cards I mentioned here today, although they do seem really bad on their face, I actually think are pretty darn good in certain decks and certainly should see play. This is almost a 5 cards that should see more Commander play video, essentially, because all these cards here, again, I watched that video of all the worst cards in the history of Magic, and these are 5 that I picked out that I'm like, actually, not too bad in certain situations. But that is what I'm doing here. I'm looking at some of the worst cards, supposedly, again, it's all subjective, but some of the worst cards apparently ever printed in the history of Magic, and how can we actually use them in the Commander format. And I think there's actually some pretty not bad ones here. You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.